Before Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the 1450s, the average person in the Western world had never even seen a book. By the 1500s, books were not only mass-printed, but the linguistical, cultural, religious, and political landscape of Europe had been transformed into something that continues to impact the modern world today. The history of the press began in Asia, but Gutenberg knew nothing of their work. Gutenberg was heavily influenced by the books of the Middle Ages. In Europe at this time, books were made by monks who would painstakingly create illuminated manuscripts, spending hours on each page to get it right. The monks worked without candles or any type of heat or light, fearing that a fire could wipe out the work of generations. The manuscripts were beautifully done, and always in Latin, the language of the church, since the manuscripts were religious texts and usually rich private collectors' items. By the 13th century, books were produced by commercial workshops instead of by monks, since demand by students, scholars, and professionals had risen. An increasingly literate middle class meant there was a higher demand for books. However, the commercial workshops were no more efficient than the monks had been, and it could take one copyist 5 full months to make one manuscript. In fact, it took Vespancio da Bistici's workshop of 50 scribes 22 months to produce 200 manuscripts for Cosimo de' Medici. Although Marco Polo's writings had spoken of Chinese block printing to make paper money, it took longer to carve a single printing block than to copy many pages, and Gutenberg knew that there had to be a better way to meet the rising demand for books. In order to compete with the illuminated manuscripts of the time, Gutenberg knew that his invention would have to make books not only readable, but also beautiful. Gutenberg's breakthrough came when he decided to make his type from a single mold, so that all the type would be nearly identical in size, leaving a uniform impression. Unlike his Asian compatriots who had used type in the flat and round shape, Gutenberg chose to make his type tall, narrow, and square, which meant that the pieces of Gutenberg's type fit together well when they were placed together. Since Gutenberg wanted to imitate the copied books of his day, he made the type identical to the letters drawn by copyists. Gutenberg also discovered that the best metal for casting type was antimony, because it did not shrink when it cooled. This ensured that the type would not cool into uneven shapes. Finally, Gutenberg put his type on an iron bed, encircled by a metal frame which was called a chase. The chase held the type together because of the pressure exerted on it through bars in its frame and small wedges between the bars. This meant that the paper would not get smudged and allowed for blank spaces on the paper, otherwise known as negative space, which made the text more appealing to read. Gutenberg also adapted the wine press to hold the chase and designed the bed of the press to slide in and out. In this way, the printing press was created. Although the Gutenberg Bible is extremely famous, historians believe that only about 180 copies of the Bible were ever produced. And Gutenberg never became rich off of it due to litigational disputes with Johannes Faust, a man who had lent him money to create the printing press. Despite this, the Bible created a furor across Europe, as it has been estimated that there were perhaps 30,000 books in all of Europe before Gutenberg printed his Bible. Gutenberg laid the foundation for mass printing, as less than 50 years later, there were as many as 10 to 12 million books. Although censorship of books had always existed, it was a lot easier for the Catholic Church or for monarchies to censor a dozen copied manuscripts than thousands of copies printed by the presses. One of the texts which could no longer be censored as strictly was the Bible, which was printed in every language but Latin, and caused a religious revolution because the Church was unable to censor every copy produced. However, generally, printers got most of their work from the government and did not want to offend it.
The overwhelming desire of the printers is to stay on the right side of the authorities, not to challenge them. It's a bit different in Germany, where something could be published 30 miles away and in a different jurisdiction. But in the big nation states like France and England, there's really no dissident print at all. The other thing is the government is an extremely good client, because they're providing a lot of the work.
The politics of the era were marked significantly by the invention of the printing press. As a result of Luther's insistence of the personal relationship between an individual and God, the Lutheran Bible was written in German instead of in Latin, which contributed to the development of a more standardized language and increased access to knowledge. As publishers produced books in the vernacular, they eliminated other dialects in the region and helped create the emergence of national languages. Since books and other printed works were in a language that people could understand, social literacy also began to increase. Although social literacy and the printing press are linked, the uptick in social literacy did not happen immediately after the invention of the printing press, but instead began to occur many decades after its invention, when the industry had established itself and the cost of books had become more economical. As the price of books increased, reading became more accessible to people other than scholars or the upper class. The majority of widely read fictional English books began to appear in the 1480s, some 30 years after the invention of the printing press. The first book to be printed in the vernacular language was printed in 1461 and was called Edelstein, a collection of fables written by Ulrich Boner. Most of the bestsellers of the late 15th century were written in the vernacular, demonstrating the interest people had in these books. However, some scholars argue that European society was literate before the invention of the printing press, and that the invention merely resulted in a different type of literacy. Others argue that the printing press changed European society from an oral culture to a literal one, in which books were read for leisure.
Because of the sense of a personal commitment and personal understanding of your faith, Luther was a major pioneer of universal education and also of female education. Because until this point, female literacy had lagged far, far behind male literacy. But virtually every new Protestant state establishes schools for girls as well as schools for boys. And this begins to close this huge gap between male and female literacy.
The increased social literacy also showed itself in the scientific revolution. As access to published materials increased, science were more able to share information because they could quickly reproduce diagrams, pictures, and tables for mass consumption and readership. As a result, scholars were more interested in taking the time to produce accurate and useful illustrations. Since the sharing of ideas is vital to scientific inventions, as we saw with Gutenberg's printing press itself, which combined different older inventions, the printing press ushered in an era where many inventions eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, although the Renaissance began before the printing press became widely used, the printing press played a key role in spreading the Renaissance and its humanistic ideas. In Gutenberg's time, the entirety of Europe was under the influence of religion. Consequently, many of the first printed books were on the topic of religion. Therefore, it is impossible to discuss the Reformation without discussing the printing press. It was the printing press that enabled the potential of the Reformation.
And what I find most extraordinary about Luther is that he should intuitively understand how to create books for this market. That's what I find extraordinary. You know, after all, he's a middle-aged monk who's done reasonably well without ever seeking fame, and yet he becomes an extraordinary pioneer. And I suppose it's that, you know, some people just get new media and some people don't, and he's one of the ones that does.
In fact, the Roman Catholic Church agreed that only members of the clergy were qualified to interpret the Bible. As a result of this limitation, the theological literacy of the remainder of the population was impeded. Once the barrier of the limited distribution of theological texts was lifted through the printing press, religious literacy would go beyond the clergy, setting the stage for the Reformation. The printing press communicated the radical ideas of the Reformists to the uneducated masses, who in turn heavily influenced the course of the time period. The printing press, in essence, embodied the main idea of the Reformation. That idea is that people can be alone before God, with nothing else in between them. What the printing press accomplished was making that relationship possible. People no longer needed the clergy or scholars to read and have access to theological texts, thus allowing them to move closer to God. Today, as we sit in the throes of the digital revolution in which knowledge can now be easily accessed online, it is more important than ever to remember the invention of the printing press, which democratized knowledge for the masses and was an invention so revolutionary that little about its use changed in the next 300 years. The printing revolution transformed every single aspect of life in the world, and much of the credit is due to Johannes Gutenberg's exploration, the people's encounter, and the ideas exchanged through its use.